Oh, George, you're nuts. Oh, well, hello, fellow travelers. Well, let me start with a confession. For years, I've been a little suspicious of nuts, not because I don't like them. I actually love them, but because every time you flip the bag over, the calorie numbers feel like they're yelling at you. Healthy food, they say. Calorie dense, the label replies. And if you're older, like me, or in a GLP-1, you're probably wondering the same thing I did. Are nuts actually helping me or quietly sabotaging me? And so today we're going to go nuts, but in a control, evidence-based, no loss of sanity kind of way. Because when you step back and look at the science, the randomized trials, the meta-analyses, the real human data, something interesting starts to show up. Whole nuts don't behave the way calorie math says they should. They don't seem to cause weight gain. They consistently improve cholesterol. And somehow, some of the calories never even show up in the final accounting. So today we're not talking about nut butter, not flowers or chocolate covered anything. We're talking whole nuts, real nuts, chewed like actual food, eaten by actual people, especially older adults like myself. So before we fear the calorie numbers, let's look at what actually happens to people who eat nuts over time. Before we look at the data, let me briefly tell you who I am and why this channel exists. I am George. By training, I'm a biological scientist. I've spent decades looking at systems, how they respond, how they adapt, and what happens when you give them the right signals over time. But I'm also walking this road right alongside you. I'm doing this later in life, and I'm on a GLP-1, and I care deeply about what actually works, not in theory, but in real bodies. So this channel exists to slow things down, to replace fear with understanding, and to look carefully at the evidence without hype or extremes. And unfortunately, extremes are out there, and in spades. That's how we approach every topic here, including nuts. And here's what we're going to do today, what we're going to cover today. First, do whole nuts actually help the heart? Not in headlines, but in real studies that follow people for years. Second, do nuts really cause weight gain? Because if you're older or in a GLP-1, that question matters. And third, what does all this mean in real life? And how do we use this information without turning food into a math problem or a source of stress? We'll lean on the strongest evidence. We'll lean on systematic reviews and meta-analyses and randomized trials, and then translate it into something practical. So let's begin where the evidence is strongest. Not with calories, not with opinions, but with long-term outcomes. What happens to the heart and to longevity when people regularly eat whole nuts? When we talk about nuts and health, this is the place to start. Not with cholesterol numbers, not with mechanisms, but with the biggest outcomes we have: mortality and heart disease. Large studies following people for years, sometimes decades, have asked a simple question: what happens to long-term health when people regularly eat nuts? And when these studies are pulled together into high-level reviews and meta-analyses, a very consistent pattern appears. People who eat nuts regularly have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, lower rates of dying from heart disease, and they also have lower all-cause mortality, meaning fewer deaths overall from all causes combined. And that is the big picture. These aren't dramatic overnight effects. They're steady, meaningful reductions that show up across different countries, different dietary patterns, and different age groups. And what's especially important is that these analyses show a dose-response relationship. And that's a scientific way of saying greater intake is associated with greater benefit, up to a point. And interestingly, most of the benefit appears with relatively modest intakes. Not handfuls all day long, not extreme diets, but small, regular amounts, and often around a serving a day, or even less. And that consistency matters, Because when results like this keep appearing in independent populations over long periods of time, it tells us we're probably seeing a real biological signal, not just healthy people doing healthy things. So before we talk about cholesterol or calories or digestion, it's worth sitting with this. Whole nuts are consistently associated with lower mortality and lower risk of heart disease. All right, now let's zoom in and look at what randomized trials show for something more specific, cholesterol. Okay, so we're going to narrow the lens a bit and look at one important pathway by which nuts affect cardiovascular health. And that, of course, is cholesterol. And this is where the evidence gets especially strong, because here we're not relying on observations. We're looking at randomized controlled trials, which is the golden standard. And in these studies, people are assigned to eat specific amounts of whole nuts, things like walnuts, almonds, pistachios, mixed tree nuts, and then researchers track what happens to their blood lipids over time. And when dozens of these trials are pulled together into systematic reviews, meta-analyses, a very consistent result shows up. LDL cholesterol goes down. Total cholesterol also goes down. Not just in one study, not just with one type of nut, but across many trials, many populations, and many nut varieties. What's important here is the scale. Some of these analyses include thousands of participants and dozens of controlled trials. And that helps smooth out the random noise, the confounders, and individual quirks, and lets the true signal come through. And the size of the effect? That's not trivial. We're talking about LDL reductions on the order of 5 to 10 milligrams per deciliter, which is very much in the range of what we care for clinically, especially over time. And what's also interesting is that no single nut dominates the outcome. There's no king here. Walnuts don't win. Almonds don't win. The benefit appears to come from shared characteristics among all these nuts: unsaturated fats and fiber, plant sterols, rather than something magical about one specific nut. So when we talk about nuts and cholesterol, we're not talking about anecdotes here. We're talking about controlled experiments that repeatedly point in the same direction. And that gives us a solid cardiovascular foundation to build on. So next, we're going to tackle the question that usually comes up right after this. You probably heard it. If nuts are so calorie dense, how exactly does this work without weight gain? So this is where things kind of get interesting, because this is the question that almost everyone asks. I certainly asked it of myself. If nuts are high in calories, and they are, how do they keep showing benefits without driving weight gain? And to answer that, researchers didn't just speculate. They actually measured. In control feeding studies, people were given specific amounts of whole nuts, often almonds or walnuts. And researchers tracked how much energy was actually absorbed by the body. Not what the label predicts, not what calorie math assumes, but what really happens. And what they found was surprising. A meaningful portion of the fat in whole nuts never gets fully absorbed. Nuts are built from tiny plant cells with tough walls. And even when you chew them, many of these cells remain partially intact. And that means some fat stays trapped and passes right through without being fully digested or absorbed. So the calories your body actually takes in can be noticeably lower, sometimes 30 to 50%, than what the label actually suggests. And yes, this was measured directly, including energy excretion. Science isn't glamorous, but it's honest. And there's another reason this works in real life. Whole nuts usually don't get added on top of everything else. They tend to replace typical snack foods like chips and crackers, like cookies, And when that happens, you're not just changing calories, you're changing fiber, fat quality, chewing time, and satiety signals. And this is what I mean. Raw almonds, raw walnuts, nothing added, nothing engineered to make you eat the whole bag. Just whole foods that slow you down and behave very differently than most snacks do. And just to flag this, almonds and walnuts aren't the only good options. Variety matters, and we'll come back to that, including one nut you don't want to overdo. So now we can talk about the obvious follow-up question. If nuts are calorie dense, even if some calories aren't fully absorbed, what actually happens to body weight when people eat them regularly? This is where randomized trials are especially helpful. And in these studies, people are assigned to include whole nuts in their diets, often daily. And then researchers track body weight, body mass index, and waist circumference over time. And when those trials are pulled together into meta-analyses, the result is remarkably consistent. Whole nuts do not lead to meaningful weight gain. Not over weeks, not over months, and in many cases weight stays neutral and sometimes it even trends slightly down. And that matters because it tells us nuts aren't quietly undoing everything else that people are trying to do, especially later in life. Okay, so now let's talk briefly about diabetes risk. Observational studies often show lower rates of type 2 diabetes among people who eat nuts regularly. But here's the key detail. When researchers adjust for body weight, those associations largely disappear. That tells us something important. Nuts don't appear to reduce diabetes risk by directly lowering blood sugar on their own. Instead, their benefit seems to operate through weight stability and satiety and better overall diet quality. And that fits perfectly with what we've already seen. Whole nuts help people eat more intentionally. They feel fuller, and they also displace foods that push weight and blood sugar in the wrong direction. So taken together, the picture is pretty clear. Whole nuts don't promote weight gain. They don't sabotage metabolic health. And when they're used thoughtfully, they fit comfortably into an eating pattern that supports long-term health, including for older adults and for people on GLP-1s. Which brings us to the practical question. If we're going to include nuts, how do we do it wisely? And what kind of nuts, what kind of amounts, and what should we watch out for? So let's bring this down to real life. If you're going to include nuts, how do you do it in the way that helps and doesn't hurt? First, think whole nuts, not nut products. Whole almonds, walnuts, pistachios, hazelnuts, pecans, raw or dry roasted, no added salt, nothing sweetened, nothing engineered to disappear in 10 minutes. Second, portion still matters. Most of the benefits we've talked about so far show up with relatively modest amounts, roughly 15 to 30 grams, so up to an ounce. In a moment, I'll show you what that actually looks like. But third, variety is your friend, because different nuts, if you look at them holistically, they bring slightly different fat profiles. Some have more fiber, some have less fiber, more minerals or less. Some have more iron, more potassium, more phytonutrients. So you don't need to optimize this. Just rotate. Now, there is one exception worth mentioning. One of my favorites, Brazil nuts. And they're nutritious, but they're extremely high in selenium, a trace mineral with a very narrow safe range. 1, maybe 2 Brazil nuts a day is more than enough. Eating them by the handful day after day can push selenium too high to the point where it can become toxic. And this is, of course, one case where more is not better. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. Whole nuts work best when they're treated as food, real food, not fuel. not supplements, and not a test of willpower. And they replace less helpful snacks. They slow you down. They support habits your body understands. And now let me make the portion size more real to you. Okay, so what do we have here? From my pantry, a bag of California walnuts. Also from my pantry, a bag of almonds, and I have more nuts. And, many nuts live this place too. So here's what 30 grams of nuts, walnuts, and almonds look together. That's about an ounce. So this is the typical serving that is kind of the helpful serving. You could probably eat more than this, but again, at some point, the calories will stack up. But this is a good portion to start with. So let's take a step back and pull this together. Whole nuts aren't magic. They're not a hack, and they're not a loophole in the laws of physiology. But they are a really good example of something important. Whole foods don't behave the way spreadsheets say they should. They interact with chewing, digestion, satiety, and behavior all at the same time. And when you look carefully at the best evidence, the randomized trials, the meta-analyses, the long-term studies, we have a consistent picture that emerges. Whole nuts support heart health. They improve cholesterol. They don't promote weight gain, and they fit comfortably into eating patterns that work later in life, including for people on GLP-1s. And the bigger lesson here isn't really about nuts. It's about learning to trust real food again. This is a lesson that has been resonating with me over the past few months. To step away from fear, from calorie panic, from the idea that every bite is a moral decision. Again, progress doesn't come from perfection. It comes from repeatable habits. And sometimes these are small habits, reasonable choices, and patience with your own body. And physiology responds when we give it clear, consistent signals over time. So yes, I am giving you permission to go nuts in a healthy and thoughtful way. And if this has been helpful, I'm really glad you spent this time with me. And if you'd like to support the channel, please like and subscribe, because what it does, it generally helps me to keep doing this work, which I really do enjoy. And if you're walking this road later in life or navigating a GLP-1 therapy, know this, my friend, you're not behind and you're not broken, and you can do this. So stay curious, my friends. Be patient with your body and be at peace. This is George with GLP-1s for Seniors. And God willing, I will see you next time.